Hey, well-met travelers. Thanks for stopping by. Today I'm trying out some new tools and a little bit of a different format. I'm going to try to start doing some more low-effort commentary content rather than scripting videos. I'm still going to do scripted content, but I'm finding that the workload is more than I'm able to take on with my 40-hour-a-week job. So trying to bang out a scripted video and edit a scripted video all by myself every week or so is just not going to cut it. So to remain part of the conversation, I'm going to be doing stuff like what you're watching right now. And what you're watching right now is me reacting to an article from the Mary Sue, which is a website, not a character type. The Mary Sue is kind of a feminist-leaning media and pop culture website and news site. And this article has been raising some hackles among the usual pack-led channels and their social media accounts. And it's an article titled, "It's Time to Admit Rings of Power is Doing Tolkien Lore Better Than the Movies," by one Janal Bhatt. And I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. If I'm not, my apologies to the author. And I agree with this sentiment in some ways. In other ways, I don't. So I'm going into this blind, and we're going to see what the article says. Hopefully I won't go through the entire article because I would like you to go read it yourself, but we'll go through the first few paragraphs and I'll share my thoughts about what we're seeing. I do like that they included this shot from the finale of season 2. This was a great shot and it very much evoked the feeling of Tolkien to me. This is Gil-galad and Elrond and Galadriel and Arondir overlooking the Valley of Imladris, and Gil-galad instilling hope in a defeated people after a very dark defeat. For those who don't really know the lore very well, this is the valley that will one day be the location of Rivendell, the elven city that we see in The Lord of the Rings that is ruled by Elrond. So great shot. One of my favorite shots from the show. I have this right now as my desktop. So let's dive into this article. The opening paragraph says, "Here's a take that could get one canceled faster than streaming platforms cancel fantasy shows after one season." Nice dig at Netflix there. Despite major departures from canon, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, is doing Tolkien lore better than the Lord of the Rings movies. I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I would say it's doing the themes of Tolkien better than the movies. Some of the themes, anyway. There are many, many themes in Tolkien's stories, some of which he put there consciously and others of which emerged from people reading them. But lore and theme are not the same thing. But there are some bits of lore that I think the show does better than the movies. So let's continue. Second paragraph says, "I know one does not simply make a statement like that. But before you point your sword, bow, and axe at me, hear me out. I am obsessed with the Peter Jackson movies, which remain the GOAT." True that, very true. "But simultaneously, I can also accept that the trilogy altered much of what Tolkien purists would call canon. This is why it is absurd that people aren't as open-minded about what Rings of Power is doing with its adaptation, especially as its themes are a better homage to Tolkien's deep lore than the movies were." Okay. Again, I'm unclear what this author means by lore. I think they might be mixing up lore with themes, but we'll see. But at face value, I think I would agree with a lot of this. There's a double standard among the pack-led channels and the other people who complain about the Rings of Power and really any modern pop culture property for being too woke, right? They will give a pass to things that they liked when they were a kid, like, for instance, the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson made gigantic changes to the lore, not just superficial ones, but they give that a pass because they liked it when they were kids or for whatever other reason. But when they look at Rings of Power, which makes changes to the lore as well, they treat it with a double standard. They're not honest about what they're doing, and they're not approaching it in good faith, in my opinion. The changes made in Peter Jackson's movies, some of them are at least as big as the ones made in the Rings of Power. And I think the conversation would be served much better if we all just admitted that. I'm going to hold back on talking about some of the big lore changes Peter Jackson made, because I think this article might get into them. But if not, I will lay out some of them when we go forward. So, the next section says, the Lord of the Rings movies were not true to canon either. Right, as we just established. The author says, I have no issues with how they changed things from the books to fit the story they were trying to tell. Sure, Glorfindel was robbed when they gave Arwen the role of saving Frodo from the Nazgul. We never got Tom Bombadil. Additionally, while Book Aragorn proudly owned his lineage as the heir of Isildur and worked towards claiming his birthright, movie Aragorn's internal struggle made the story more effective for non-readers. Even something as basic as timeline crunching, where Frodo didn't have to wait for 17 years for Gandalf to return and confirm the truth about Bilbo's ring, made sense when you realize it's impossible to depict Tolkien's elaborate timelines. Now that is absolutely true. Tolkien was a great writer, but let's face it, the man had no sense of narrative scaling, at least when it comes to the construction of his histories. The important things that happen in the timelines in the appendices of Lord of the Rings or in the Silmarillion and so forth don't really seem to happen with any sense of urgency or scale, right? Hundreds or thousands of years will pass between the important plot points of Tolkien's histories, and adapting that to the screen faithfully by making those timeline gaps intact would be incredibly boring and would totally drag the narrative pacing of the show, a show about which many people have already complained about the narrative pacing. So if we left hundreds or thousands of years between, say, the Battle of Eregion and the fall of Numenor, it would be a very different show, and I'm not sure it would be a better show, because we would have characters who are not elves passing in and out of the story basically as guest stars, and I don't think it would work very well, frankly. And like the author here, I have no issues with the changes that Peter Jackson made between book and movie, because it made the movies stronger. And if he had left some of those things intact, the movie probably would have suffered from it a little bit. So let's continue with the article author here. She continues, as such, some of the most redundant criticism against the Rings of Power not sticking to canonical portrayals of characters and compressing timelines, like Numenor's political upheaval happening at the same time as the Siege of Eregion and the War of the Elves and Sauron, need to be dismissed, as it makes the show's storytelling more effective. As for how in touch it is with the lore, let's get into it. Okay. So she didn't go too much into the changes Peter Jackson made here, all right? So I'll just go through them in a quick bullet point thing, and this is by no means comprehensive. We could start with the fact that Peter Jackson changed the personality and motivation of almost every single character in this story. As the author of this article points out, Book Aragorn was not a reluctant, self-doubting character. He was very confident about what he wanted. Gimli was not comic relief for most of the story. Legolas had actual conversations with people. You know, he wasn't just there to look pretty. Merry and Pippin were not a couple of dipshits. Let's not talk about Denethor, for God's sake, or Faramir. Frodo did not abandon Sam at any point. The way that the One Ring is destroyed in the book is very different from the way it happens in the movie. And again, all of these changes make sense for a film adaptation because they make it more fun to watch. But one of the consequences of that, an unintended consequence of that, is that a lot of Tolkien's spiritual and religious themes and his moral themes either got entirely reversed or were absent. And this is one of the reasons that Christopher Tolkien hated Peter Jackson's movies and began the legal process that ultimately led to the Rings of Power TV show, which is leaning into those elements of Tolkien a lot more than the movies did. So there you have it. Let's continue with the article. I don't want to take too much thunder away from this. So the next section says, the Rings of Power may deviate from canon, but it is still grounded in lore. I'm not sure what the difference there is. Maybe she'll explain it, but okay. The author continues, since season 1, The portrayal of Galadriel as a warrior and commander of Gil-galad's northern armies, and the absence of her husband Celeborn, has bugged many Tolkien purists. They hated that Galadriel went to Numenor and tangled with Sauron, and that the Elven rings were forged before the other rings. Let me interject here and point out that the Rings of Power, the TV show, is having the rings get created in the order that they are mentioned in the ring poem. 3 rings for the Elven kings under the stars, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, etc., and then the 1 ring to rule them all. That's the order the rings are being made in the show. So to say that the order in which the rings are being crafted in the show is a violation of Tolkien's lore is not really a valid criticism, because again, it's following thematically with that poem, even though the poem, if you take it as a tale of the ring's creation that exists within the universe of Middle-earth, contradicts other bits of histories that Tolkien wrote in other sources. So, and not coincidentally, the Peter Jackson movie did the same thing in its prologue. It shows the rings being crafted in exactly the same order. And again, that's a change from the book to the movie that works on screen, right? Because it follows the rhythm of the ring poem. So the movie and the book are doing the same thing with the creation of the rings. Anyway, let's pick up where we left off. After talking about the rings, the author continues, they've also spoken out against Annatar being present at the Siege of Eregion instead of Sauron attacking Eregion after having forged the One Ring and learning of Celebrimbor's betrayal. Right? That sentence also is worth stopping to pause on here. The important narrative bit for the story of Eregion, as it concerns any adaptation, the important narrative bit is that Sauron brought an army to Eregion, and Eregion fell. That's the important thing, and that's what happens in the show. Sauron manipulates Adar into bringing the Orcish army to the Elven city and laying siege to it, and the city falls, which is what needs to happen to drive the story forward. The details about how that happened can be changed to enhance the story that you're telling and still be consistent with Tolkien's actual story. So the final sentence of this paragraph says, then, of course, there is the biggest digression of them all. Why was an Istar that looks suspiciously like Gandalf on Middle-earth as early as the Second Age and traveling to Rhûn? And again, I would argue that this is valid creative license based on some of the things that Tolkien wrote in sources outside of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Maybe the author's going to mention that here. Let's see. She continues, the more Rings of Power built on its mythology, the more critical Tolkien fans disliked it. The Stoors never lived in the desert. They were river folk. Sauron, as shapeless black goo, is stupid. He was a powerful Maya, and Sauron could never have seduced Galadriel, and their relationship could never have romantic undertones because Galadriel was married to Celeborn and had a daughter. We've heard all this before. So here's the article author getting to her point, I think. However, what is often overlooked in these parroted criticisms and rigid adherence to canon is that the Rings of Power borrows heavily from Tolkien's writings, especially his many obscure drafts of different timelines, events, and character arc suggestions. The lore was confusing in many places, and even his son, Christopher Tolkien, who compiled and completed some of his father's works, admitted in books like Unfinished Tales that there was no definitive vision for many of the stories. For example, yes, the wizards only arrived in Middle-earth in the Third Age, but there were some writings in which Tolkien wrote that they could have arrived in the Second Age too. Okay. Again, that's very true. I've pointed out on my channel before in other videos that Tolkien had no consistent vision for the events of the history of Middle-earth, and in some ways that was intentional. He was trying to mimic the way that we actually study history in the real world. We're always working with incomplete records. The farther back you go, the more unreliable the sources become because there are so few of them. Other narratives or other accounts of events that may have been written down may not have survived. I mean, the Library of Alexandria was burned multiple times over its history. Who knows what was lost? So Tolkien was sometimes being contradictory on purpose because he wanted to mimic the way that historians have to, or he wanted the readers to mimic the way that historians learn about the past. And there are other ways it's inconsistent, not on purpose, because he just hadn't made up his mind yet. He famously tinkered with the backstory of Galadriel well into the final month of his life. So he did say, I think it's in History of Middle-earth, that Gandalf, before he was called Gandalf, when he still was called Olorin, is said to have traveled among the elves in the First Age, and possibly the Second Age too. The Blue Wizards, which are being partially adapted for the TV show, came in one version of the story to Middle-earth in the Third Age with the other wizards. In another version of the story, they came during the Second Age. In one version of the story, they started cults of dark magic in the East, which would be Rune, that aided Sauron. And in another version of the story, they spent a lot of time undermining Sauron's influence in the East, and without that influence, Sauron would have won against the men of the West in The Lord of the Rings. So the point being that there's just a lot of ambiguity in the so-called Tolkien canon, and any adaptation would have to make arbitrary choices about which versions of those stories they wanted to use for their own story. And that means that fans who are angry about changes to the canon are themselves making arbitrary decisions about what they consider to be the true lore and which versions of those stories they are ignoring. So we're all in the same boat here, folks. I'll go on a little bit farther here. The next section says, the Rings of Power teases out different interpretations that are still rooted in Tolkien's writing. I think I just made that point myself. The author continues, Tolkien never really details what happened with the Dwarven Rings of Power, other than they amplified their greed. Nor does he write much about Rune or what Sauron was up to in those long periods that he'd disappear from action, like after the fall of Morgoth, and after the One Ring was cut off his finger by Isildur. It's all about filling in the gaps with imagination to tell an engaging story. So when the Rings of Power chooses to fill these gaps with an interesting interpretation and some new original characters like Adar, inspired by Tolkien's tidbits from the First and Second Ages, it's a fantastic expansion of the story while still respecting the lore. I would agree with that too. Adar is one of my favorite of the new characters, and his entire character arc engages with some obscure bits of Tolkien's writings where Tolkien was struggling with the way he had portrayed orcs in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Tolkien's own theology and own moral beliefs led him to conclude that because he had given the orcs the power of speech, that therefore meant they had immortal souls who could be saved by grace. And yet he had written them as being basically cannon fodder who could be killed indiscriminately within The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But if you look at his expanded works in the Legendarium, you will see him wrestling with that question. And you can read texts like Morgoth's Ring, which inject a lot of sympathy into orcish existence and make them a lot more nuanced. They are still irredeemable. In Morgoth's Ring, for instance, he describes them as irredeemable by men and elves, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're irredeemable by other means. But still should be shown mercy and compassion and sympathy when they're taken captive, even if doing so requires making sacrifices to the safety of elves and men. And he also describes them in Morgoth's Ring as being oppressed by Morgoth. So Adar is a way to explore that tension in Tolkien's own thinking through a narrative device. And that's one of the reasons Adar is one of my favorite characters in the show. Oh, and we're going to talk about Arondir too, another one of my favorite characters. The author of the article continues, take the character of Arondir, the Sylvan elf, for example, who is the most Tolkien-esque elf there ever was. Yeah, I described him in another video as the elfiest elf who ever elfed. The author says, his scenes are steeped in deep reverence of trees and nature, and the scene with the Entwife in season 2 is so unquestionably and movingly Tolkien, it's impossible to understand how there's still any criticism of his character. It's hard to see it as anything but racial profiling of an actor of color. Yes, that part is 100% true. Much about the trees, the elves, and the Ents wasn't part of the Lord of the Rings movies, but Rings of Power makes excellent use of its format to slow down and bring you these themes that were present but not as pronounced in Jackson's interpretation. I agree with all of that. No notes. Let's continue with the author's article here. Similarly, Tolkien has indicated in multiple instances that Galadriel, whose mother called her Nerwin, meaning man-maiden, or perhaps Guy Ladriel, was of Amazonian build and would often participate in athletic feats, defeating other elves. So why would it be hard to believe that she was a warrior who could be a commander of an elven army? All right, let's consider this part right here. Why would it be hard to believe she was a warrior who could be a commander of an elven army? Now, I alluded a minute ago to the phrase Guy Ladriel, which is something that pack-leds like Nerdrotic and Critical Drinker and Shadiversity and all those other clowns at the Friday Night Spite podcast, Friday Night Tight podcasts, they use that phrase Guy Ladriel as an insult to the character on Rings of Power. And the fact that they do that shows that they don't understand Tolkien, and that they probably haven't read as much Tolkien as they pretend to, because if they did, they would know about the whole her mother name was Nerwin, meaning man maiden, because she was so tall and strong. And Tolkien describes her as being the equal of the greatest athletes and lore masters of the Eldar. That phrase lore master is interesting, because if you follow the footnote that's attached to that in the Silmarillion and the other places where that story appears, you will see that Tolkien said the lore masters were great kings and warriors. I'm not sure why he used the word lore master, because that implies scholarship, and some of the characters he lists as lore masters were great scholars as well. But he specifically says they were great kings and great warriors. So when Tolkien says that Galadriel was the equal of the greatest athletes and lore masters of the Eldar, he is saying she was the equal of the greatest athletes and warriors of the Eldar. So what we're seeing in the Rings of Power may not follow a specific list of biographical events taken from multiple different versions of Galadriel's backstory, because again, any decision about what is actually true about her backstory would be arbitrary, as Tolkien wrote multiple different versions of that over the course of his life. The version we're seeing in the Rings of Power is consistent with what Tolkien himself wrote about Galadriel's abilities and personality, right? So let's finish this paragraph, and I think that'll be enough to get the point. So after that, the author of the article says, Sauron killed her brother Finrod, and knowing the Noldor elves' inclination towards revenge, is it that baseless to believe Galadriel would take up arms against her brother's killer and become obsessed with her dark mission when she was still much younger, only to have these wars and experiences shape her into the wise Lady of Light that she eventually becomes? Tolkien may not have explicitly written this version of her, but he certainly planted the seeds. Yes, that was the point I was just making. Right? Now think about the complaints you hear about Galadriel on the show being a so-called Mary Sue or a Karen or whatever. And think about if the show had done something different. Imagine the Rings of Power had taken Galadriel as the Lady of Light right from the beginning, and just had her be unchanging and incredibly powerful and incredibly wise through the entire show, and not really changing very much. Do you really believe that the pack-led channels would say she wasn't a Mary Sue? I think they would. I think they would say that. So what we're seeing in the Rings of Power is fine. I think it's a great show. I've been reading and rereading Tolkien my entire life. I've read the entire Legendarium at least once. I've read bits of it multiple times. And I like almost everything about the show. I do have some quibbles, but none of them are deal breakers for me. And yeah, I think we've said enough. You folks should go check out this article and read the rest of it for yourself. It is, once again, it is on the Mary Sue website, and it is called "It Is Time to Admit Rings of Power is Doing Tolkien Lore Better Than the Movies" by Jinal Bhatt. Published October 13th of this year. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you saw and you want to see more of this kind of content, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications, leave comments down below, share this video wherever you can, and remember that until next time, what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.